Now, for more on this steel issue, I'm joined by Dan McClory of Bowstead Securities, live from San Diego. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Rachelle. Excited to talk about this summer of steel that's going on right now.
Indeed. Now, let's also start with China's efforts in really cutting steel overcapacity. What sort of progress have we seen so far?
Well, I think you've seen a flight to quality. So China has decided that they have to become more efficient, which is ultimately good. And we need to look at what I call the lag indicators, not the leading indicators. So the lag indicators are things like exports and production, but the leading indicators are indicators like consumption of byproducts, such as iron ore, such as coking coal. And there's been a flight to quality for those base materials that comprise the ultimate product of steel. So somehow this structural shift is starting to occur in the Chinese steel industry.
Now, some people might be wondering, why are we seeing a pickup in steel output when the number of steel factories in China were being closed down?
It has to do with the infrastructure boom. Clearly, there's an effort underway in China to rejuvenate and stimulate the economy through infrastructure investment and infrastructure building. And that's taking place. It obviously requires steel. And that's why you're seeing whatever production is available that hasn't already been cut back on is, for the most part, being used within China.
So then when you hear these complaints from countries like the U.S. about China's steel production, what more should the Chinese government be doing to really try and curb production?
Right. Well, really, the steps that they're taking, we can start with Mr. Lee and how he's talked about taking out the long knives to these zombie companies. So some of the large state-owned enterprises that everyone acknowledges are inefficient, those types of reforms are underway. You're also going to see some seasonal adjustments, Rachelle, especially in the Northeast with winter coming, where in an effort to curb pollution, those factories are going to have to throttle back production as well. So that's taking place. And again, it kind of puts China in the position of accomplishing two goals at once, which is reining in some of this excess production, but also contributing to ultimately a better environment.
Now, as we saw from the U.S. Commerce Department, in 2016, they said that the top countries the United States imported steel from were Canada, South Korea, Brazil, and Mexico. China was 10th on that list. So why is Trump frequently referencing Chinese steel and exports and considering some of these additional tariffs and quotas on China versus any of the other countries on that list?
Right. Well, Rachelle, you and I have talked about a number of these grease fires or distractions or even disruptions from President Trump. He's really taken, I think, a page from a Westerner's playbook about China, where for years Westerners said in China an agreement is a pause between negotiations and you can't rely on it, which is obviously not the case. So Trump is now going around various agreements, like we heard earlier in the show, the WTO, for example, and invoking national security with this Section 301 filing, which allows him to take unilateral action. So, but when you look at it factually, as you described, 17% of the U.S. steel imports are coming from Canada, 3% come from China. There really is not that much of a difference. It's a populist economic issue. It plays to the base of President Trump, and he's going to use that just to keep his support going.
Now, it's interesting because, as you mentioned, the so-called summer of steel, we know that China is really gearing up to expand its infrastructure projects, and some U.S. companies are actually predicting a surge in Chinese demand, which actually boosts their bottom line. So where is that disconnect happening?
Well, again, it's separating, like you've always done a good job on your show, Rachelle, the politics from the economics. So the rhetoric is coming from politically driven statements. Even take someone like Wilbur Ross, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, who said, we're going to take bold action. And now he says the issue is complex. He understands the realities of what you just talked about, which is who is actually exporting steel to the U.S. Who's on that list? And China is a smaller player. So I put this in the category of political rhetoric, not only feeding the base, but some would say that the UN Security Council vote that took place recently that had to do with North Korea, which was unanimous, they've scored that as a victory for Trump. The Chinese have come in on the side of that. So they're saying perhaps there was some consideration of this talk of steel imports being restricted or being assessed tariffs, but no one really knows. I think it's a lot of bluster.
And so, Dan, with that being said then, how do you think Trump's handling of trade issues with China will affect the broader China-U.S. trade relationship going forward?
Well, clearly, he's not averse to pushing buttons, and he's not averse to keeping people upset and offside and really unexpecting what's coming next. So I think China is now understanding that that's a tactic. That's not necessarily his ultimate execution or policy implementation, but it's a tactic. So I think China is going to come prepared, and they're going to be able to withstand these various attempts to disrupt and to keep them off balance. They're going to stick to their agenda. Ultimately, Rachelle, if these tariffs come into play, there will most likely be retaliation. There will be action taking place on both sides. They will not be unilateral. And I don't think anybody wants to see it come to that.
And we've certainly seen a lot of people agree with that. Thank you so much, Dan McClory of Bousted Securities.